The morning sun had barely risen over the dusty streets of Dry Creek, painting the wooden facades of the saloons and general stores in streaks of orange and gold. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if it, too, sensed that something unusual was about to unfold. A low wind whispered across the square, stirring loose papers and the occasional tumbleweed. In the center of the town, on a crude wooden platform, a man's fate hung by a rope, and a small crowd had gathered to witness what they called justice. She had arrived that morning on horseback, her cloak wrapped tight against the chill, and a look of fierce determination in her eyes. Most of the townsfolk barely noticed her, too absorbed in their anticipation of the execution, but she did. She noticed everything's the anxious shift of the sheriff's boots, the trembling hands of the witnesses, the man's weary, haunted eyes staring into the crowd. There was something about him that didn't fit the usual outlaw tale. Something in his gaze hinted at a story far deeper, far older than anyone in Dry Creek could imagine. As the executioner tightened the noose around the man's neck, she felt a surge of defiance that refused to be silenced. Without a second thought, she rode forward, her voice cutting across the murmurs of the crowd, commanding and fearless. The crowd gasped, some stepping back in shock, while others whispered curses and warnings. But she pressed on, her eyes locked on the man who was seconds away from death. In that instant, she didn't see a criminal, a stranger, or a condemned man. She saw a soul bound by circumstance, one that deserved a chance to breathe again. The sheriff's hand went to his gun, his face tightening with disbelief, but she held her ground. There was a fire in her that no authority, no law, could extinguish. With a swift motion born of sheer determination, she cut the rope, and the man stumbled, free yet weak, into her arms. The crowd erupted in chaos, shouts of outrage, calls for pursuit, and the clattering of boots on the wooden boards of the square. Yet through it all, her focus remained unwavering. She had risked everything for a stranger, and in that fleeting moment, she sensed that this act of courage was only the beginning of a far larger story. The man, still dazed and blinking in the sunlight, tried to gather his thoughts, but the confusion in his eyes mirrored her own. Neither spoke at first. Words were unnecessary in the heat of adrenaline and peril. All that mattered was survival, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, the threat of death had passed. Yet even as relief washed over them, the weight of uncertainty settled in. Who was he, really? Why had he been condemned? And why, deep in her gut, did she feel that his story was entwined with forces far beyond Dry Creek and the law of men? She guided him out of the square, through narrow alleys and past shuttered windows. The town still buzzing with the aftermath of her bold act. The air smelled of dust, leather, and the faint temps of smoke from chimneys, a reminder of the frontier life they both had been thrust into. Her horse snorted, sensing the tension, and the man, though still weak, found the strength to mount beside her. For a fleeting moment, the world felt suspended, as if holding its breath for what was about to unfold next. It was only when they were riding through the outskirts, away from the prying eyes of Dry Creek, that she noticed something peculiar. The man carried himself with an ease and dignity that felt out of place in a town filled with desperados and gamblers. His features, sharp yet noble, hinted at a heritage that commanded respect, though he had done little to reveal it. His hands, calloused yet deliberate, suggested a life of skill and discipline, perhaps more than the simple outlaw tale that had nearly ended in a noose. As the miles of prairie stretched before them, dotted with sagebrush and the distant outline of mesas, she felt a growing awareness of the enormity of what she had done. She had not simply saved a man from the gallows. She had unleashed a force she barely understood. There was a story behind him, one tied to lands, people, and traditions, older than the towns of Dry Creek. She could sense it in the way he carried himself, in the subtle glimmer of something unspoken in his eyes. And though he had said nothing yet, she could feel that this was no ordinary man. Her mind raced with questions she had no answers to. How had he come to be captured and condemned in a town so far from what she guessed was his homeland? And why did the way he looked at her suggest both gratitude and a deep, hidden sorrow? Every instinct told her that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that the story she had stumbled into was far from finished. The air was heavy with anticipation, thick with the unspoken truth that the world beyond the prairie held secrets, dangers, and revelations that could change everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and identity. As night began to fall, casting long shadows across the open plains, the man finally spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying a weight that resonated beyond his years. "I owe you my life," he said, and she nodded, not fully trusting words to convey the depth of the moment. But there was something in the pause that followed, a hesitation in his gaze that spoke louder than any words could. A truth he was holding back, a secret that could alter the course of their journey before it had even begun. Stars began to appear, small pinpricks of light over the endless horizon, and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant mountains. She glanced at him again, her instincts prickling with both caution and curiosity. There was more to this man than met the eye, and deep down, she knew that the gallows had only been the first chapter of a much larger story. A story that would demand bravery, resilience, and a willingness to confront truths she could barely imagine. Unbeknownst to her, the man she had rescued bore a legacy that reached far beyond the plains of Dry Creek. A legacy rooted in leadership, honor, and the traditions of a people whose history had been forged in both struggle and survival. And though he had not yet revealed it, she had unknowingly become a part of something far greater than a simple act of mercy. Her decision to save him would ripple across lives, lands, and hearts in ways neither of them could yet comprehend. As the night deepened, and the first sounds of distant coyotes echoed across the prairie, she tightened her grip on the reins and allowed herself a single, steadying breath. Danger was near, and the world they were about to enter was one of shadows and uncertainty. Yet in the quiet of the desert night, with the faint shimmer of moonlight guiding them, she felt an unshakable truth: whatever secrets were waiting to be uncovered, she would face it. And somehow she knew, so would he. The wind shifted, carrying a faint but unmistakable scent of smoke and earth. And the man's eyes flicked toward the horizon. There was tension there, an unspoken warning, and she realized that the story was far from over. The gallows had been only the beginning, and the journey that lay ahead promised danger, revelation, and a confrontation with destinies neither of them could yet see. She felt her heart quicken, a mix of fear and anticipation as she and the man rode into the darkness. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, and with every step, every heartbeat, the mystery of who he truly was loomed larger. In that vast, quiet wilderness, she knew that the choices made in Dry Creek would echo far beyond the town's dusty streets. And as the first flickers of firelight appeared in the distance, she sensed that the real story was only just beginning, a story of courage, legacy, and a secret that could change everything. The man she had saved was more than he appeared, and the road ahead was filled with dangers and truths waiting to be uncovered. The night held its breath, and so did she, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Would she survive the journey with him? Would the truth of his heritage bring them safety or peril? And could a single act of defiance against the law truly alter the fate of a life so deeply tied to the past? As the wind swept across the plains, carrying the weight of countless untold stories, the answers remained shrouded in shadow, leaving her and the audience on the edge of anticipation. The gallows were behind them, but the real test was just ahead. The firelight they spotted in the distance grew slowly as they approached, flickering against the rocks and sagebrush in an almost hypnotic rhythm. The man's hand brushed against the hilt of a hidden knife at his side, a motion so natural it spoke of countless hours spent moving cautiously through unknown terrain. She noticed it but said nothing, trusting instinct and experience in equal measure. They were not just riding into darkness, they were riding into uncertainty, a place where every shadow could conceal friend or foe, and every sound could signal danger. "Do you have a name?" she asked finally, her voice breaking the tense silence between them. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as though the very question carried weight far beyond her understanding. "Some call me Crow," he replied, his voice low and even, with a tone that suggested a history both honored and burdened. Crow. It was a simple name, yet it carried a strange resonance, like the whisper of wind across ancient canyons or the echo of a drumbeat in the distance. She repeated it softly under her breath, letting the syllables settle, aware that a name in the frontier carried both identity and story, sometimes more than a person could bear. As they rode closer to the fire, she saw figures moving around it, men and women wrapped in blankets and furs, their faces partially obscured by shadows. There was a quiet authority among them, a sense that this place was protected, even sacred. Crow slowed his horse, his posture shifting to something more cautious, almost reverent. He whispered instructions she could barely catch, and the group by the fire responded with subtle nods, as though the mere mention of his presence carried weight. The realization struck her hard. This man she had rescued from the gallows was not merely a stranger. He was someone of importance, someone whose very existence demanded secrecy and respect. One of the figures stepped forward, a tall woman with piercing eyes that seemed to see through the dim light and straight into Crow's soul. "He's safe," Crow said simply, his voice firm, yet tinged with relief. The woman's gaze swept over her, sharp and assessing, before she inclined her head in acknowledgement. "And you are?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, and then simply said, "I am someone who believes a life should not be taken without reason." The woman studied her for a long moment, and finally, as though making a decision that balanced caution with trust, she gestured toward the fire. As they approached, the warmth from the flames offered a brief comfort against the chill that had settled in the prairie air. Crow dismounted, moving with a fluidity that suggested both grace and practice, and the woman handed him a small cup of what smelled like herbal tea. He drank slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if expecting something or someone to appear. She watched him, a mixture of curiosity and unease stirring in her chest. There was a story here, a history so layered that it would take hours, maybe days, to even scratch the surface. Yet the pull of it, the mystery surrounding him, was impossible to ignore. "I need to know," she said, leaning closer, lowering her voice so only Crow could hear. "Why were you in Dry Creek?" "Why the gallows?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, silence stretched between them like a living thing. Finally he spoke, his words deliberate and measured. "I was sent away," he said, "to live among strangers, to hide from those who would see my bloodline used for power or destroyed out of fear. What you saw in Dry Creek was only a piece of a larger plan. I meant to erase who I am before I could claim it." She frowned, trying to understand, but his explanation only deepened the mystery. There were threads here she could not yet grasp, stories buried in places she had never imagined, in lands and traditions that were older than the towns she had grown up near. The woman by the fire stepped forward again, holding a small bundle wrapped in leather. She laid it on a flat rock and untied the laces to reveal what looked like ceremonial items. Worn but cared for, feathers, a carved wooden emblem, and pieces of cloth dyed with earth tones. She looked at Crow with an intensity that made him flinch slightly. "It is time," she said softly, "for him to remember who he is, if he is to survive what comes next." The words were weighty, and though she did not explain further, their meaning was clear. This was no ordinary fugitive. This was someone connected to a heritage, a lineage that carried expectations, responsibilities, and dangers she could barely comprehend. Crow knelt before the items, closing his eyes, and the air seemed to shift around them. The flames flickered, shadows dancing against the rocks, as though acknowledging some unseen presence. She watched, spellbound and unnerved, as a transformation seemed to occur not physical, but in the way he held himself, the way his eyes sharpened, and the tension in his shoulders eased into something almost ceremonial. She realized then that this man was bound by forces far beyond any frontier law, and her role in saving him was no longer a simple act of courage. It had become a thread in a story that was ancient, tangled, and dangerous. Questions flooded her mind, each one heavier than the last. Why had he been hidden among strangers? Who were the enemies he feared? What exactly was he meant to remember or reclaim by the firelight that now seemed almost sacred? The more she learned, the less she understood, yet a strange clarity emerged. This was a moment she could not walk away from. Whatever lay ahead, the choice to stay or to flee was hers as much as his. And something deep in her gut whispered that fleeing would no longer be an option. Night deepened, and the small group by the fire fell silent, save for the crackle of flames and the distant hoot of an owl. Crow rose, holding the ceremonial items close, and she could see the determination etched across his features. This was a man shaped by circumstance, by loss, and by a responsibility he could not abandon. She sensed that the dangers awaiting him and now, by extension, her, were not confined to the lawless towns of the American frontier. They were rooted in a larger struggle, one that crossed lands, families, and generations. She shivered despite the warmth of the fire, partly from the chill in the air and partly from the weight of what lay ahead. Crow glanced at her then, his eyes locking with hers in a way that made the hair on her arms stand. "If you stay," he said quietly, "there will be no turning back. The world you knew ends with Dry Creek." She swallowed, the tension coiling in her chest, and nodded. "You know," she said simply, though the words barely captured the truth of what she felt. There was fear, yes, but also a strange exhilaration, a pull toward something bigger than herself, something urgent and dangerous. The fire crackled between them, and shadows danced across the rocks, carrying the weight of untold stories. Around them, the night seemed alive, as though holding secrets that could not yet be spoken aloud. She realized that the gallows had only been the first step in a journey that would test courage, loyalty, and understanding in ways she had never imagined. And though she had saved him, she knew the real danger and the real story was only just beginning. Crow spoke again, his voice barely audible above the crackle of flames. "They will come," he said, "and they will not stop until they take what is ours or destroy it." She felt a cold shiver of realization. The threat was not abstract. It was real, immediate, and relentless. The man she had saved carried a legacy that many would kill to control or erase, and she was now entwined in it, whether she wanted to be or not. Her mind raced, wondering how she could possibly protect him, herself, and the fragile trust forming between them in this moment. Above, the stars shone cold and distant, indifferent to human struggles, yet illuminating the endless plains before them. She mounted her horse again, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a cloak she had not asked for, but could not remove. Crow followed, carrying his past, his heritage, and a destiny that demanded courage beyond any frontier tale she had known. And as they moved into the night, the firelight shrinking behind them, the air seemed charged with possibilities, both perilous and profound. The gallows had been behind them, but the horizon held shadows of a far more dangerous kind. She could feel the pulse of history, of unfinished stories, pressing against every mile of the prairie. And though questions remained unanswered why, he had been condemned, who sought him. And what he truly represented, one thing was certain. The journey ahead would reveal truths they were not prepared for, confrontations they could barely imagine, and decisions that would echo far beyond the boundaries of Dry Creek. Every step they took drew them deeper into uncertainty, yet neither of them turned back. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of wind, distant animals, and the faint creak of leather saddles. The world they had known was gone, replaced by something vast, mysterious, and alive with danger. And in that darkness, as the stars blinked above them like watchful eyes, she realized that the man she had rescued was far more than he seemed, and that the story they were about to live would test every ounce of courage, trust, and skill they possessed. Somewhere ahead, unseen, the first signs of pursuit would emerge. Shadows would move, alliances would be tested, and secrets buried deep would demand revelation. And yet, in the quiet of that endless prairie night, she held on to a single thought. They had survived the gallows. Now they had to survive each other and the past that would not stay buried. The journey had begun, and the prairie held its breath. The wind had shifted again by the time they reached a narrow canyon tucked between two low mesas. And with it came a strange, almost electric tension in the air. Crow rode a few steps ahead, his eyes sharp, scanning every ridge and shadow. She followed close behind, her hand resting lightly on the saddle horn, her senses alert to every creak of leather, every whisper of the grass under their horses' hooves. The prairie had stretched endlessly behind them, but ahead was uncertainty wrapped in shadows, a reminder that the gallows were only the first danger. They had not gone far before Crow finally spoke again, his voice quiet yet heavy with meaning. "There are those who would see me dead, or worse, taken before I can reclaim what is mine. You must understand." He paused, looking at her with eyes that seemed to carry centuries of memory. "What we face is not just men with guns. It is a struggle over a legacy, one that has survived because it was hidden, because it was protected by bloodlines older than these towns." She listened, trying to grasp the weight of his words, feeling the pull of a story far larger than her own life, one that would demand courage she hadn't known she possessed. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the shadows thickened, and she noticed that Crow seemed to move differently here, lighter and more attuned to the land. His every motion spoke of someone who had grown up knowing how to read the earth, the sky, and the unseen paths that could hide both friend and enemy. "You've lived like this before," she said, half as a question, half as an observation. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it carried more weight than any answer could. The canyon widened into a hidden valley, and she saw signs of life's small structures made of wood and stone, smoke curling gently from low fires. A few people moved among them, their movements quiet but purposeful. Crow's gaze softened briefly, but the tension never left his shoulders. "This is a place of safety," he said, "but it is not peace. Danger follows those who carry what I do." She felt the gravity of his words, realizing that the calm of the hidden valley was fragile, temporary, and deceptive. Even here, the outside world could reach them, and the threats lurking beyond the horizon were relentless. One of the valley's inhabitants approached, a man older than Crow but with the same sharpness in his eyes. He studied her carefully, then turned to Crow. "He's awake," he said, the words carrying a weight of history and expectation. Crow nodded, and the man turned back to her. "You should know," he said slowly, "the ones who seek him will not stop. They are patient, cunning, and ruthless. They will exploit any weakness, any hesitation." She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This was no ordinary outlaw tale. This was a pursuit rooted in centuries of power and fear, and she had unknowingly stepped into it. The night stretched long, and the valley became a place of quiet preparation. Crow and the others worked in near silence, tending to horses, sharpening tools, and moving with an almost ritualistic precision. She tried to keep pace, her curiosity mingling with fear, but it was clear she was an outsider, someone untested in the ways of the valley. Still, every glance from Crow reminded her that she was not to be dismissed. Her courage had brought them this far, and her choices would continue to shape the path ahead. Later, as they sat near a fire, Crow began to reveal fragments of his past, carefully measured to teach without overwhelming. "I was born into a line meant to lead," he said, tracing a finger along the worn emblem he had carried since the valley. "The world outside does not understand what it means to protect such a heritage. There are those who would see it destroyed because they fear it, or because they wish to claim it for themselves." She listened, absorbing the weight of his words, sensing that the danger was as much political and cultural as it was physical. Every name unspoken, every movement unmade, hinted at enemies she could not yet see. The firelight flickered across Crow's face, and she saw the strain etched into his features, the worry, the responsibility, the sense that every step forward could invite disaster. "You must understand," he said quietly, "this is more than a fight for survival. It is a fight for identity, for honor, and for the memory of those who came before me. If I fail, it is not just me who suffers. It is generations of a people whose history has already been threatened countless times." She felt the enormity of what he carried, and in that moment, a mixture of awe and fear settled over her. She had thought she was rescuing a man from injustice, but now she realized she was entangled in a struggle that was ancient, layered, and ruthless. As the night deepened, sounds began to echo from the edges of the valley, deliberate and unnerving. She tensed, realizing they were not alone. Crow's hand went to a small pouch at his belt, retrieving something she could not yet identify, and his eyes narrowed. The older man in the valley moved silently, signaling them to prepare, and the tension in the air thickened. Something was coming, something deliberate, something that would test every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage they possessed. The first figure appeared, stepping lightly from the shadows. The firelight revealed a stranger whose presence carried danger like a second skin. Crow's eyes met hers, a silent warning passing between them. The stranger spoke, a voice smooth, deliberate, and cold. "You cannot hide him forever," the man said. "The legacy he carries will be taken, one way or another." Crow's jaw tightened, his hand brushing the emblem at his belt. "You do not understand," he replied evenly, though the edge in his voice betrayed the threat beneath. "Will not be taken from you willingly." The stranger's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "We shall see," he said, stepping back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the tension between the unknown visitor and the defenders palpable. She realized then that the threat was not only from men with guns or axes, but but from forces that moved in the shadows. Patient, calculating, and relentless. This was a war fought in silence, with eyes watching from places unseen. The next morning, the valley stirred with urgency. Crow and the others moved quickly, preparing for the possibility of another intrusion. The older man gathered a small group to discuss strategy, speaking in low, measured tones. She tried to follow, but much of what was said was unfamiliar, steeped in knowledge and tactics she had never encountered. Still, she understood enough. Danger was coming, and they had little time. Every choice mattered, and mistakes could be fatal. Crow approached her later, his expression softer, but no less serious. "You may not fully understand yet," he said, "but your presence here changes the equation. Some will see you as a threat, others as leverage. You must be cautious." And yet he paused, eyes scanning the horizon. "You are not powerless. Courage, quick thinking, and trust are more important than you realize." She nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavier than ever. She had saved him from the gallows, but now survival depended on more than bravery, depended on understanding a world she had barely glimpsed. As the sun rose high above the valley, the horizon seemed calm, almost deceptive in its beauty. Yet she could feel the undercurrent of tension, current that carried with it the knowledge that enemies were moving, plans were unfolding, and the past was alive in ways that could reach across miles and decades. Crow mounted his horse again, glancing at her. "We cannot wait for them to come," he said. "We must act first, even if we only move in shadows." She gripped her reins tighter, a mix of fear and resolve in her chest, knowing that every step forward would draw them deeper into danger, deeper into the story she had barely begun to understand. They rode out of the valley, moving along hidden paths that only Crow seemed to know intimately. The land around them was beautiful and unforgiving, the kind of beauty that could conceal peril in every fold of rock or rise of earth. She noticed the way Crow moved, not just with skill, but with a deep awareness of his surroundings. Every rustle, every distant sound, seemed to register with him instantly. She knew then that she would have to learn quickly, or risk becoming a burden he could not afford. As they traveled, Crow spoke occasionally of the past, vague references to battles fought, alliances made, and betrayals endured. Each fragment of his story deepened the mystery, hinting at a life filled with duty, danger, and unspoken obligations. She realized that the man she had rescued was not only fighting to survive, but to reclaim something fundamental, something that tied him to a history she could barely imagine. And in doing so, she had become a part of that fight, her courage entwined with his legacy in ways that were unavoidable. By nightfall, they reached another high ridge overlooking a wide expanse of prairie. The stars glimmered cold and distant, and the wind carried the scent of distant fires. Crow stopped, letting his horse graze lightly, and she followed suit. Silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the awareness that their journey had only just begun. She could feel the pulse of danger in the night, the certainty that eyes watched them from unseen places. And in that silence, she understood the truth. The gallows had been only the first challenge, and the real test was just beginning. Above, the night stretched endlessly, and she felt the weight of anticipation pressing against her chest. Crow's gaze swept the horizon, his expression unreadable, yet she sensed a storm of thoughts and plans beneath the surface. Whatever lay ahead, she realized, would demand more than courage. It would demand trust, intelligence, and a willingness to face truths that could shake the very foundation of what she believed. And as the prairie stretched out before them, dark and full of secrets, she could not help but wonder what dangers were coming next, and would they be ready for them when they arrived. The wind had grown colder as night fell over the prairie, carrying with it the scent of distant fires and something sharper, almost metallic, that made her stomach tighten. Crow moved ahead, his horse barely making a sound on the rocky trail, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, as if he could see threats that were invisible to her. Every muscle in his body was tense, prepared for action, and she realized how little she truly understood about the life he led, the dangers that pursued him, and the depth of the legacy he carried. They had been traveling for days through hidden passes and narrow valleys, places known only to those who had walked the land long before towns and railroads claimed it. Crow occasionally spoke of these paths in quiet tones, explaining that they were more than trails, they were lifelines, ways to evade enemies who moved with ruthless determination. "They track more than footsteps," he said one night as they made camp in a hollowed-out rock formation. "They watch the wind, the sun, even the stars, and they do not forget." She felt the weight of his words settle deep inside her. This was no ordinary pursuit. They were hunted by people who thought in strategies that spanned generations. By the third night, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every sound, a snapping twig, the distant howl of a coyote, even the rustle of their own horses made her flinch. Crow moved silently around the small campfire, checking traps and keeping watch, his expression unreadable but fierce. She tried to help, but she was painfully aware of her own inexperience in these matters. Still, she could feel that her presence mattered, that the act of saving him had created a bond neither of them could ignore, even in the shadow of danger. The valley where they had stopped for the night was surrounded by jagged ridges, and the shadows between the rocks seemed to move with a life of their own. Crow noticed it first, stiffening as he scanned the darkness with narrowed eyes. "They are close," he murmured, more to himself than to her. She felt a cold knot tighten in her chest, the realization hitting her that their enemies were not far off, and that any moment could erupt into violence. Her grip on the fire poker tightened, and she silently promised herself that she would not let fear paralyze her. Then, a rustling broke the stillness of the night, a sound that was too deliberate to be random. Crow's hand went to the hilt of his knife, and he motioned for her to stay low. She crouched behind a boulder, her heart hammering as she tried to make herself invisible. Shadows flitted across the rim of the ridge, dark shapes that moved with purpose. She caught glimpses of figures, cloaked and silent, their eyes glinting like steel in the firelight. These were no ordinary thieves or bounty hunters. They were skilled, patient, and prepared to strike with deadly efficiency. Crow emerged from behind his cover, stepping lightly and deliberately, his presence commanding and fearless. He raised his hand, signaling her to hold still, and then moved closer to the edge of the ridge, his gaze locked on the approaching figures. "They know where we are," he said quietly. "They have been watching. They're testing us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the reality she had walked into. She had thought she was helping a man flee injustice, but now she realized she was part of a battle that involved planning, patience, and skill honed over lifetimes. The enemy did not make a sudden attack. Instead, they advanced slowly, their movements almost ritualistic, like predators circling a kill. Crow's eyes followed them, calculating, reading each step, each pause. "They are trying to provoke us," he whispered, "to make a mistake." She understood then that brute force would not win this encounter. Strategy, caution, and instinct were the only weapons they had. Her pulse raced, but she forced herself to focus, to learn from every subtle movement, every sound that hinted at danger. Hours passed like this, a tense standoff in the cold night. Neither side acted, yet every second carried the weight of potential disaster. She could feel the air thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that made her skin prickle and her muscles ache with readiness. Crow remained calm, but the intensity in his eyes betrayed a constant mental calculation, a rapid assessment of possibilities, each one potentially lethal. She realized that surviving this night depended not only on courage, but on understanding him, his instincts, and the terrain that now felt like a living part of their battle. As dawn approached, the first pale light creeping over the horizon revealed more of the terrain, and with it, the movement of the enemy became clearer. Crow signaled for her to follow him, and they began to retreat deeper into the rocky ridges, slipping through narrow passes only he seemed to know. The enemy pursued quietly, never rushing, never giving away the extent of their numbers. And each step they took into the canyon carried them further into uncertainty. She could feel the weight of every moment, the possibility of ambush lurking in every shadow. By mid-morning, they found themselves on a high plateau overlooking a wide expanse of desert. From this vantage point, Crow studied the land, tracing paths with his gaze, and she realized that he was planning more than escape. He was preparing for confrontation, positioning them where they might have the advantage, even in a world that seemed to offer none. She tried to read the lines of his face, searching for any hint of what he was thinking. But Crow was an enigma, revealing only what he wanted her to know. Yet she could sense his concern for her, the unspoken acknowledgement that she had become part of a fight she had never anticipated. The tension built further when they spotted movement on a distant ridge, a small group of riders appearing and disappearing among rocks, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. Crow squinted, hand shading his eyes, and then turned to her. "They are splitting into smaller groups," he said. "They want to surround us, isolate us. They'll try to force a confrontation where we have no choice." Her stomach knotted at the thought. She had imagined danger, but the scale of what they faced, the cunning of their enemies, and the immediacy of the threat made her realize how high the stakes had become. Hours later, they reached an abandoned settlement nestled in a rocky hollow. Crow guided her through narrow alleys and ruined buildings, scanning constantly. The enemy had been patient, waiting for mistakes, and the moment she felt the first sense of safety, Crow reminded her that it was temporary. "They will come," he said simply. "And when they do, we must be ready." She nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed with the urgency of the warning. That evening, as they made a small fire in the ruins, Crow shared more of his past, fragments that hinted at battles fought in secret, of alliances forged and broken, of betrayals that had left scars on his people and on himself. Each story deepened the complexity of their conflict, revealing that the threats they faced were as much about politics, power, and history as they were about survival. She listened, captivated and unnerved, realizing that the man she had saved was carrying burdens far heavier than she could have imagined. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, sound cut through the quiet, a faint whistle, almost melodic, but chilling in its precision. Crow froze, every muscle taut, eyes narrowing. "They are here," he said, his voice low but commanding. She felt a chill of fear mixed with adrenaline, knowing that the standoff she had feared for days was now imminent. The wind carried more than the scent of the desert. It carried the promise of conflict, the shadow of confrontation that could decide everything. Shadows began to move along the edges of the ruins, figures emerging from hidden vantage points. Crow's hand rested on the emblem at his belt, a silent ritual of focus and resolve. He moved her behind a crumbling wall, keeping his body between her and the threat. She realized the depth of his commitment, not only to survival, but to protecting the legacy he carried, and now her life intertwined with it. The first shots rang out shortly after nightfall, piercing the air with sudden violence. Crow returned fire, precise and controlled, while she ducked and scrambled, trying to understand how to act without getting in the way. The chaos was immediate and terrifying, the clash of survival instincts and strategic skill unfolding in the moonlit ruins. She could see the enemy pressing closer, patient and deliberate, their movements calculated to exploit any misstep. And as she watched Crow move among them, commanding and fearless, she realized that the climax of their struggle was approaching, and that every choice in the next moments would carry weight far beyond life and death. Above them, the stars were obscured by clouds, the darkness pressing in like a living thing. The wind howled through the hollow, carrying with it dust, grit, and the cries of confrontation. She clung to her place behind the wall, heart hammering, and understood fully that they were on the edge not just of a battle, but of revelations, of truths that could alter their lives forever. And though Crow had prepared her, though he had shared fragments of his past, she knew the worst was yet to come. The forces that pursued them were patient, skilled, and unrelenting, and the night held secrets that could change everything in an instant. Every step, every breath, every flicker of shadow seemed charged with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Crow moved like a shadow among shadows, and she followed, learning, adapting, fighting to survive. The enemy pressed closer, their strategy unfolding with deadly precision. And as the ruins became a battlefield, she understood the truth fully. They were not merely fighting for life, but for a legacy, for honor, for a story that stretched across generations. The night pressed in, and the sounds of confrontation swelled around them, a chaotic symphony of danger and survival. Crow glanced at her once, a silent acknowledgement of what lay ahead, and she realized that the climax, the moment where courage, skill, and fate would collide, was only moments away. Every heartbeat, every shadow, every breath carried the weight of what was to come. And in that tense, electrified darkness, she understood with certainty that nothing would ever be the same, and the resolution of their struggle hung just out of reach, waiting for the decisive moment that had yet to arrive. The enemy was closing in. The night was alive. And their story was about to reach the edge of everything. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, softening the harsh outlines of the ruined settlement and the jagged ridges beyond. The night had been merciless echoes of gunfire shouts, and the tense shuffling of movement still lingered in her mind, and the air smelled of smoke and dust. She lowered herself from behind the wall, her hands trembling slightly, and glanced at Crow. He was still alert, eyes scanning every shadow, every distant ridge, yet there was a new steadiness in his posture. The storm of the night had passed, at least for the moment, and something in the early light made the world feel both fragile and alive. Crow walked toward her, careful, deliberate, and for the first time in days, his expression softened. "We survived," he said quietly, not as a statement of triumph, but as a recognition of the narrow thread between life and death. She nodded, feeling the tension in her body ease slightly, though she knew the danger had not fully passed. Their enemies would retreat, regroup, or perhaps rethink their strategy, but the immediate threat had been handled. And yet, the knowledge of how close they had come lingered, a reminder that survival demanded both courage and wisdom. They moved together through the settlement, noting the signs of their adversaries' retreat. Tracks in the dust, discarded weapons, and the faint traces of campsites marked the path the enemy had taken. Crow bent occasionally to inspect something, his fingers brushing the earth, his mind always calculating. "They are clever," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "They will return if we make mistakes, if we let our guard down. But they will not find what they are truly looking for, not here." She followed him closely, absorbing the way he read the land, understanding at last that this was more than instinctive, was heritage, training, and deep knowledge passed down through generations. As the sun climbed higher, they reached a small rise overlooking the plains. From this vantage point, the world seemed endless, a sea of golden grass and distant mesas. Crow paused, letting the wind carry his gaze, and she could see the weight of responsibility etched across his features. "I was hidden for a reason," he said, almost to himself. "Protected, so I could reclaim what was mine without bringing harm to those around me." She understood then that every choice he had made, every step of their perilous journey, had been driven by more than survival. It had been about restoring balance, preserving a legacy, and honoring the memory of those who had come before him. She stayed quiet, letting him speak, realizing that this man, the one she had rescued from the gallows, was not just a survivor, but a bridge between past and present. His story was intertwined with the land, the people, and a history that demanded respect. And now, in this moment of relative peace, she felt the full weight of what she had done. By saving him, she had become part of a story larger than herself, one that carried danger, responsibility, and unexpected meaning. Crow turned toward her, his eyes searching hers. "You risked everything," he said, "to save me, and in doing so, you have shown courage beyond what I could have imagined. But this is only the beginning." She nodded, feeling both pride and apprehension. The night had tested them, had pushed them to the edge, yet it had also revealed their strengths, their resourcefulness, their trust in each other, and the determination that neither danger nor doubt could extinguish. The older man from the valley approached, carrying a small bundle. He handed it to Crow without a word, a silent acknowledgement of completion, of legacy preserved. Crow unwrapped it to reveal items of cultural and personal significance, small emblems, feathers and cloths that had been kept safe through generations. He held them close, reverence in every movement, and she realized that these objects were more than symbols. They were a living connection to his people, his identity, and the future he was destined to shape. As the morning grew warmer, they began to move again, this time with purpose rather than fear. Crow led her along hidden paths, teaching her the ways of the land, showing her how to read subtle signs, how to anticipate danger, and how to trust instincts. Each lesson was practical, yes, but also symbolic lessons about courage, resilience, and the necessity of balance between action and patience. She began to understand that the story of their survival was inseparable from the story of his people, and that the legacy he carried demanded respect, protection, and understanding. Along the way, they encountered other small communities, people who had known Crow in passing or through stories. Each interaction reminded her that the world was larger than Dry Creek, that there were webs of connection, history, and loyalty she had never imagined. Crow treated each meeting with care and tact, navigating potential threats while honoring alliances. She observed him, learning not just strategy, but empathy, diplomacy, and the quiet authority that came from living in accordance with one's principles. The days passed, and with each sunrise, the tension eased slightly, though the awareness of potential danger never left them. Crow spoke more of the legacy he had reclaimed, of the responsibilities that awaited him, and of the importance of preserving the knowledge, traditions, and stories of his people. She listened, absorbing every word, realizing that the journey had changed her as profoundly as it had changed him. Her life had been ordinary before, but now it was intertwined with courage, survival, and history, with lessons she would carry forever. One afternoon, as they rested on a ridge overlooking a narrow canyon, Crow spoke quietly about the people who had sought to take his heritage. "They were not just after me," he said. "They wanted what I represent, the lineage, the authority, the connection to a history that cannot be erased." She shivered, realizing that the danger had been far deeper than the gallows, far broader than Dry Creek, and that their journey had been a fight for something enduring, something sacred. "And we stopped them," she said softly, though she knew the battle was never truly over. Crow smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and solemnity in his gaze. "For now," he said, "but the path ahead requires vigilance, honor, and courage. You have both." They continued through the plains and valleys, returning to the hidden sanctuary where Crow's people had awaited the resolution of the threat. There was celebration, quiet but heartfelt, as the older men and women acknowledged the preservation of their heritage. Crow moved among them with humility, yet with the quiet authority of someone who had faced peril and emerged steadfast. She watched, realizing that the climax they had endured was not just a victory in battle, but a reaffirmation of identity, resilience, and community. That evening, as the sun set over the mesas, Crow and she sat quietly on a ridge, the horizon ablaze with colors that mirrored both the intensity and beauty of the journey they had survived. "You've changed the course of my life," he said, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "And I hope in some way my story has changed yours." She nodded, feeling a profound connection to him, to the land, and to the legacy they had preserved together. The night was calm, the stars slowly appearing, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace, a fragile, hard-won peace that came from facing danger, understanding courage, and honoring history. Crow reached out and handed her one of the small emblems that had been so carefully preserved. "A reminder," he said softly, "that bravery is not measured by the battles you fight alone, but by the courage to act for what is right, even when the odds are impossible." She held it in her hand, feeling its weight, not just as an object, but as a symbol of survival, trust, and connection. The following morning, they began their return to the outskirts of civilization, carrying with them both the relief of survival and the knowledge that the world would always hold challenges, threats, and shadows. Yet they were no longer naive, no longer untested. They had faced danger, confronted enemies, and preserved something far greater than themselves. And in doing so, they had discovered a truth that would endure long after the prairie winds had blown through empty canyons. Courage, trust, and legacy are inseparable, and sometimes the smallest acts of bravery can shape destinies far beyond imagination. As they rode together, the horizon stretched endlessly before them, golden and inviting, but layered with the knowledge of battles survived and responsibilities embraced. Crow glanced at her, a silent acknowledgement of partnership, trust, and shared experience. She smiled faintly, feeling the satisfaction of a journey that had tested every fiber of her being, and the quiet pride of knowing she had played a role in preserving history and honor. The gallows were long behind them, a distant memory of fear and urgency. The legacy of Crow, the heir to the Apache chief, was safe once more. But it was the courage, determination, and compassion she had shown that had made the difference. And as the wind swept across the plains, carrying dust and scent of distant fires, she understood a profound truth. The world is shaped not only by strength or skill, but by the willingness to act when it matters most. And so, the story came to a close, not with fanfare or triumph alone, but with the quiet, enduring recognition that courage, loyalty, and legacy are woven into the fabric of every life, every choice, and every journey. Crow and she continued into the horizon, the prairie stretching before them, the past honored, the future uncertain. but their spirits steadfast and unbroken, ready for whatever lay ahead. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying both the memory of danger and the promise of resilience. And in that moment, the story ended as it had begun, with courage, heart, and the enduring power of legacy.